Alright guys, how are we doing today? Welcome to my driver ratings for the Singapore Grand Prix. We're going in reverse championship order from last year, which means we're starting with Haas. For the Haas boys, it was a strange race because they had one driver do really well and one driver do really poorly. And I'll put you out of your misery. Kevin Magnussen did really poorly. He got out of Q1, which was good news, but unfortunately for him, his teammate qualified P6 whilst he was in P14. And then the race itself kind of went from bad to worse. He started on the hard tyre, which looked like a good move. Didn't really make much progress once the tyres of other drivers started to drop off. And then once he did pit, he then had the moment where he crashed into the wall slightly, gave himself the puncture. He then went for the fastest lap with the soft tyre, ended up exceeding track limits and didn't get the fastest lap and then retired. So ultimately didn't have a great race, and I think that just the disparity between him and Hulkenberg has been so dramatic this season. I really didn't see that happening, but yeah, really poor race. Gonna give K-Mag a 1. Hulkenberg on the other hand got through to Q3, absolutely phenomenal qualifying to put at P6, did benefit from the Ferraris blundering in qualifying, but he managed to stay ahead of Alonso and Leclerc for the first stint of the race really impressively. Unfortunately, he then got undercut by Alonso and couldn't quite make up that deficit, but finishing P9, getting some valuable points for Haas. I'm going to give him a 9. Really strong race from Hulkenberg, and honestly it could have been a 10 if he had managed to stay ahead of Alonso for the whole race, but I think that the 9 is fair. So, moving on to the Sauber team, the hardest team to rate because they are so bad. Their car is so far off the pace that there is literally no other metrics to go against other than each other, and they qualified 19th and 20th, Bottas beating out Zhou. Zhou got back ahead of Bottas in the race, and then they just kind of stayed together for the whole thing. They could have driven the best races of their lives and you'd never know because the car is so bad. So I'm going to give them both a 5. I don't really see how I can give them anything different because no one did anything phenomenal. Like, no one got ahead of too many other drivers. Like, you'd sometimes see a Valtteri Bottas pull out a good drive like that, but they did manage to finish ahead of Gasly and Ricciardo on the road, so that's something. But yeah, I think a 5 for both is fair. Neither of them had an outstanding race, but neither of them crashed in the wall. Okay, up next we've got the Visa Cash App RB, my favourite team name. And this was another one similar to Haas, where one driver had a really good weekend, Tsunoda, and one had a really poor weekend, Ricciardo. And I feel really bad for Ricciardo because it's looking like it could be his last ever race in Formula One. And yeah, it just didn't quite go to plan for him. He got out-qualified significantly by Tsunoda, him down in 16th, going out in Q1, while Tsunoda qualified really well up in Q3 in P8. And then the race for Ricciardo just didn't seem to go to plan. He ended up boxing really early on the first stint, which looked like it could be quite good because the undercut looked quite powerful, but then it turns out that the tyres were just lasting a bit longer than people were expecting. He dropped back. He then pitted a second time, which was quite unorthodox for this race. He managed to make a couple of moves on Pierre Gasly, notably, which were quite good, but then he ended up boxing at the end to get the fastest lap off of Norris, which was a little bit controversial. And ultimately, as Ricciardo is bowing out of Formula One, this is not the type of performance you want to see from him. You know, he was in contention for that Red Bull seat from Sergio Perez, and he's just not really delivered this season. Anyway, this race in particular, I'm going to give him a 2 because I'll give him a +1 point for the fastest lap because he did have to get that. On the other side of the garage, Tsunoda had an amazing weekend, I thought. Qualified in P8, as I mentioned. Again, quite fortuitous that the Ferraris didn't do well in qualifying, so that pushed him up from potentially P10 to P8. But ultimately, in a car that Ricciardo demonstrated wasn't very strong this weekend, he still managed to come home in P12. I think it was difficult for Tsunoda to stay in the points in this race because he had the 2 Ferraris qualifying behind him and Sergio Perez, and so managing to keep all of them behind would have been quite difficult. He gets an 8 rather than a 9 or a 10 because he did finished behind Colapinto, and then also you've got the likes of Hulkenberg and Alonso in similarly paced cars who did manage to extract more and get points in this race. But I think an 8 is fair for Tsunoda. Qualifying was really excellent from him, and just, yeah, a little bit of strategy in the race letting him down. Okay, up next we've got the Williams boys. Really difficult one to rate for Alexander Albon, but we'll come on to him next. I'm going to start with Colapinto. Colapinto? I'm going to start with Colapinto, who had an absolutely extraordinary race, considering the fact that he has only raced 3 times in Formula 1. To go through an entire Singapore Grand Prix without making any big mistakes is really excellent from him. Made an amazingly decisive move at the start of the race, which Albon wasn't too happy about, but just absolutely dive bombing down the inside. Managing to come home in P11 after a really strong race. He only qualified 0.07 of a second behind Albon, who has loads of experience in Formula 1. I thought this was such an impressive drive from Colapinto. He was one retirement from a front runner or like Hulkenberg or Alonso away from getting points, which is so impressive. So I'm going to give him a 9. I think if he did manage to get points, I would have given him a 10. But, you know, I'm not going to be too frivolous with my 10s. Moving on to Albon. Again, as I said, tough one to rate. He outqualified his teammate, but only just, and his teammate has only done 3 races in Formula 1. He then kind of got forced wide at the first corner, dropped back to 15th place, and then when he came back onto the track, he didn't really make too much progress forward. He only lasted 15 laps in the race, so it makes it difficult to say this, but I'm going to have to give him a 3, which seems harsh because he didn't finish the race. And for all I know, he could have made loads of progress forward in the actual Grand Prix, but it didn't really look like that was going to be the case. And I think that Colapinto kind of rattled him in that first corner as he came on the radio and said that he wasn't too happy with the move. So yeah, I'm going to give a 3 to Albon. Could be one of my harsher ratings in this video, but I'm not here to make friends. Okay, up next, Alpine. Another sort of tale of 2 different drivers in this one. They're holding on to Gasly for next year, and they're letting go of Ocon, but Ocon outperformed Gasly considerably this weekend. Gasly went out in Q1, Ocon got through to Q2. It was a decent chunk between them in Q1 as well. And then when you look at the race itself, Gasly made no real progress forward, ended up finishing behind both Sauber cars, whereas Ocon was making some decent headway, ended up finishing P13, and that Alpine, as we know, is a bit of a tractor this year. So I think this Ocon performance was really impressive, but he didn't really... There was nothing out of the ordinary. You know, he made good progress, but he didn't get a points finish, or he didn't manage to finish just outside the points like a Colapinto, for example. So I'm going to go for a 7 for Ocon. I think that's fair. Gasly, on the other hand, that was a bit of a worrying performance, finishing, I think, over 15 seconds behind Ocon in the end, qualified poorly, as I said, didn't make any progress anywhere. So I'm going to go for a 2. The qualifying and the race performance just weren't up to scratch. And so I think that, yeah, Alpine might be considering whether or not dropping Ocon was a good move now. But I guess he did, like, crash a bunch, didn't he? So, Aston Martin, another sort of one driver doing really well and one driver doing really poorly type of team, this one. We'll start with Lance Stroll, who dropped an absolute stinker this weekend. I don't think that anyone would disagree with that. Went out in Q1 whilst his teammate went through to Q3. Just didn't have any pace in this race. Didn't show any sort of signs of someone who's worthy of an Adrian Newey car that he's going to have next in the coming years. Just not showing anything, and it's so disappointing because they are putting so much faith in him. Lance Stroll, like his dad, is funding that team so healthily for him to just drop rubbish races. It kind of looked for a while this season that he was going to start catching up to Alonso, and he did outperform in a couple races, but this was certainly not one of them. Really poor performance from Stroll. Gonna give him a 2. Honestly, I think that might be a bit generous. I maybe should have given him a 1, but yeah, we'll stick with the 2 for Stroll. I'll be a little bit lenient. And then, as I said, other side of the garage, Alonso, absolutely phenomenal race from him. was caught up behind Hülkenberg in the first stint, couldn't really make a move because that Aston Martin straight line speed is really poor, but he qualified in the top 10, qualified 7th really impressively, managed to stay in front of Leclerc for the first stint, then undercut Hülkenberg, kept the gap pretty consistent to him, and then he almost got Sainz at the end, which was really impressive. If he had got Sainz, it definitely would have been a 10, but I'm going to give Alonso a 9. Really, really impressive weekend. Really good. I kind of thought, as I mentioned, with with Stroll catching up to him throughout the mid-season, I kind of thought that Alonso was dropping off a bit, but this kind of reaffirmed that Alonso still is a really good, really solid top driver in F1. Okie dokie, McLaren F1 team, the rocket ship. I'm going to give Piastri quite a harsh rating here, I think. He did get on the podium, but he was out-qualified by Norris by 5/10, putting him down in P5, whereas Norris, obviously, P1, led every lap of the race. So Piastri, I'm going to give him a 7, and I'm going to tell you why. He was miles off it in qualifying, and that put him behind the marks. For the first stint, he couldn't really do anything about getting past them. Then he boxes really late, does the nice overtakes on them, and I'm not going to take that away from him. But their race, McLaren, was not with Mercedes this weekend at all. The Mercedes was quite slow in the race in comparison, obviously, to Norris, who was just out front. McLaren need Piastri to take points off Verstappen if Norris is going to win this championship. So I think it was quite a poor one. He did end 40 seconds off the lead. And the 7, it might be a bit harsh in some people's eyes because he did get the podium, but as I say, the McLaren is so much faster than the cars around it right now that he really should be finishing P2 minimum in that race, I think. Norris, on the other hand, genuinely unreal performance. Like, I remember hearing them on the radio say, Lando, we need you to pull 5 seconds on Verstappen by the mid-teens. And I just kept looking at that gap rising and rising, and I know that their car is really fast, but he demonstrated in that race that he can dominate and he can pull out the big gaps that you kind of expect from a Verstappen or a Hamilton in the past, and that was really impressive to me. So I'm going to give Norris a 10. I don't think you can give him anything other than a 10 for that race, unless you take into consideration the 2 tiny mistakes that he made, which, if Verstappen was closer, they could have robbed him of the win. And in which case, I would have given him a lower rating. But he did dominate this race. Was unlucky to not get the Grand Slam with the Ricciardo fastest lap at the end. But I think that was probably Norris's best drive in F1. The most commanding victory he has had, definitely. And yeah, well deserving of a 10 if you ask me. Okay, Ferrari next. Difficult one to rate, I think, because the qualifying was so poor. Obviously, both got through to Q3, which is what you expect from Ferrari, but then both of them qualified 9th and 10th. I'll start with Sainz, who ended up getting caught up behind some slower drivers in the first stint with a poor start, and then he didn't really make too much progress forward in the race, finishing in P7, when I think it was quite clear to see that Ferrari was faster than Mercedes this weekend. And Ferrari, going into that race, were saying that they were still Constructors' Championship contenders, and that was completely wiped out by this race. And Sainz just having quite a mediocre performance, almost getting overtaken by Alonso in the end of the race as well. So I'm going to give him a 6. Maybe that's too generous, maybe that's too harsh, but I think 6 is right for Sainz, because at least he didn't just dwindle in the midfield for the whole race. He did manage to get to the front of the sort of mid-pack, unlike some other drivers, Sergio Perez. But we'll come on to him later. Charles Leclerc, on the other hand, after qualifying so poorly, had an unbelievably good race, I think. The tyre management from him was absolutely stupendous to take those mediums so far into the race. And I remember watching him tussling with Russell before his pit stop and thinking, why is he bothering defending this? Russell is an entire pit stop ahead of him right now. But then you saw at the end of the race, the pace that Leclerc had on the hard tyre was absolutely phenomenal. Came right up to the back of Russell, almost overtook him to take what would have been an unbelievable P4. But unfortunately it was only P5. And this is when the rating becomes quite difficult, because P5 in the Ferrari at that racetrack isn't that good a result when you look at it on paper. I think that the Ferrari, as I said, were faster than the Mercedes. Perez had a poor weekend. They should have been getting P4, P5. I think that Leclerc, if he had qualified well, could have challenged Piastri for P3. I genuinely do. So I'm going to give him an 8, which is a strong rating, I think. But I'm not saying that that was like a phenomenal, out of the ordinary, amazing drive from Leclerc. I think that it was good, and it was really good race pace, but the weekend as a whole, I have to give an 8. Moving on to Mercedes, who absolutely chucked the strategy out the window in this race. I don't know why they started Hamilton on the soft tyre. I guess they thought that they could have got past Verstappen in the first stint in the early race, but the softs just fell off so quickly. We'll come on to Hamilton after I talk about Russell, though. Russell started the race pretty well, managed to stay in front of Piastri in the first stint. The medium tyre worked well for him. He managed to overcut Hamilton, which was obviously down to the strategy. But I think that Russell generally had good pace. The Mercedes wasn't that strong in the race here, but they did manage to finish in front of the Ferraris. Russell did manage to finish in front of Leclerc at the end, which was impressive given that the tyre offset was pretty large. So I'm going to give Russell an 8. Maybe that's harsh now that I've given Leclerc an 8 as well, but I don't know. I don't think that it was anything too special, but it was very good. I don't know, I'm in two minds, but I'm going to give Russell an 8. Hamilton, on the other hand, it's so difficult because it feels harsh to give him less than Russell because he outqualified him, but Hamilton kind of, I don't know, I just don't understand why he would have let the team start him on softs. That's really confusing to me. And then when he was charging through the pack, I remember his overtake on Tsunoda, he ended up running wide after making that move, kind of dropped back a bit, lost momentum, ended up getting overcut significantly by Russell, and then later in the race, Piastri comes out like right behind him after overcutting by like 20 laps or something. So yeah, it's a tough one to rate. I'm going to give Hamilton a 7. I think it's a little bit harsh on him because it's not his fault that the strategy was bad. But at the end of the day, he finished behind his teammate. He finished behind Leclerc, who qualified way down compared to him. The qualifying was really good from Hamilton, but points are on Sundays, so I'm going to give him a 7. And lastly, the Red Bull Racing Formula 1 team, who have dropped away from being the fastest car on the grid significantly to McLaren now. We'll start with Perez, who dropped an absolute stinker this weekend. Qualifying in P13, going out in Q2 in that Red Bull is just not acceptable. Just didn't seem to want to go anywhere in the race, was stuck behind Colapinto in the first stint for ages. He did make a good start to make up a couple of places, but then he was just stuck there for the rest of the race, essentially. Coming home in P10, when Red Bull are supposed to be fighting for this Constructors' Championship, they cannot be affording those types of points from Perez, so I'm going to give him a 2. I think that could be generous. Maybe a 1 is better for him, but I think he did get 1 point, so I'll give him something for that. But just such a poor performance from Perez, and I think if Red Bull are even considering him for the drive next year, they are sorely mistaken, because that is just not what you need from a top team. And then lastly, moving on to Verstappen, who outqualified Perez significantly, was the only driver that looked like challenging Lando Norris this weekend in that Red Bull, which is severely hampered in comparison to the McLaren. I think if he had got ahead of Norris at the first corner or had managed to outqualify him, then it could have been a completely different race and maybe less boring. But I'm going to still give Verstappen a 10. I think that was a really good race. He managed to come home far in front of Piastri. And I remember when Piastri got past Russell, all the talk was, can Piastri put a dent in that Verstappen advantage? And he just didn't put any sort of dent at all. I think the gap was 18 seconds the whole time. So Verstappen's definitely driving above where that car is based on how he is versus Perez, and the fact that the car has just fallen away so significantly, and he's doing what he needs to do to still win this Drivers' Championship. So it's a 10 for Verstappen. I think that's fair. And so, now that I've concluded all of my ratings, here is a beautiful view of what all of the ratings look like. Feel free to pause the video at this point to look through them all, and feel free to comment down below which ones you think are silly, or which ones you disagree with, or which ones are the most controversial. I'm going to give my speediest boy of the weekend to Lando Norris. As I said, really dominant display. I don't think you can really give it to anyone else after he's won by such a large margin. My biggest stinker of the weekend goes to Kevin Magnussen, because he was the only one that crashed. I know that's a little bit harsh because people say that Singapore is the race of attrition, it's the one where the drivers find it the most difficult, but he was the only one that made a mistake that put him out of the race. Simple as that, so it has to be Kevin Magnussen. And yeah, that rounds up my driver ratings for the Singapore Grand Prix. You might have also noticed that this is my first ever Formula 1 video on this channel, and that's how it's going to be going forward. I'm pivoting this channel. It's something that I'm really passionate about in comparison to what I was making videos about before. So if you're on board and if you like Formula 1, get subscribed for more content. I will see you in the next one.